So wonderful to see all of you, to be with my friends at Holy Trinity. I don't know why, and in fact, I saw Bishop Todd earlier today, in fact, and I told him, said, you know, I feel a little bit like the prodigal son returning, perhaps a little bit wiser, a little bit older for sure, a little bit older. And that I was going to ask you how the fatted calf was cooking, and if you guys were ready for me. But in all seriousness, to see your kind, lovely, familiar faces that I haven't seen in such a long time, it feels incredibly heartwarming. And Tom, Father Tom, as I like to call him, he said, "Welcome home," and I feel home. I do. The kids and Esther, and let's be honest, many of you wanted to see them much more than you wanted to see me. I'm okay with that. I'm not hurting my feelings too much. But we're in this season in which juggling our schedules is a little bit like doing a puzzle of 1,000 pieces blindfolded. So we couldn't get our act together. So I am here representing the family. But they do send their hugs, and they do send their hellos, and we promise to visit soon. Many of us grew up in a time in which to see the world, we were taught in what my friend Greg Thompson describes as an epic binary struggle between the good guys versus the bad guys. My childhood was filled with narratives that fed this, inundated with storylines from TV and cinema, where from the westerns to the spy thrillers to the science fiction epics, the good guys battled the bad guys. Our histories were taught through such a lens that, well, neatly categorize the messy realities of life through simplistic binaries that we are now finding a little bit inadequate, e.g., Columbus Day. Set against the looming geopolitical realities of our time, the Cold War, it's not difficult to understand our penchant for this two-sided narrative. In the church, we would parallel this binary as we were trained to be wary of the subversive influences of the secular world, right? The secular world trademark. In more ways than one, we saw our spiritual life primarily in oppositional terms, as an epic struggle against those who would threaten our faith with their godless view of the world. We spent more than a little time in our youth groups learning about how popular music was infiltrating our souls through backmasking and heavy beats. To fight this, we were encouraged to participate in Christian versions of everything. I went through a period of my life when I only listened to Christian music, read only Christian books, went to a Christian college, and did Christian aerobics. Not completely true. I never got into Christian music. But seeing the world in such terms meant that we would view others, our schoolmates, our co-workers, our neighbors, with suspicion, in stark reductionistic and often agonistic terms. If we were the good guys, then everyone else, in one sense, were the bad guys. There was very little room for anything in between. Our gospel reading for today makes such a binary vision of the world problematic, to say the least, and points us toward a different way of being toward the world. It is, I think, as urgent of a message for us in our times as any. Now, the parable that Jesus tells in Matthew 22 starts with the premise that he's used many times over. A king wants to celebrate. A king wants to celebrate the great wedding banquet for his son, and unsurprisingly, he sends invitations to the most prominent, the outstanding citizens of the land who are nearest to him, both in locale and in stature. But when the king sends out his messengers the second time to say that the goose is cooked and the feast is ready, those invited shockingly laugh at the king's hospitality. They mock and abuse and even kill some of the messengers. Apparently, the saying, "Don't kill the messenger," was not a thing back then. They think that they have all that they need and reject the invitation of the king to his banquet. Well, the king is enraged and takes care of the mockers, rather violently, I might add. But then he says the banquet will go on. So he tells the servants that the first group was unworthy, so now go and invite everyone and anyone that you can find. Those who did not make the first cut, those who live on the streets even, it says. Both good and bad people, it says. So the outsiders become the insiders, while the insiders are now cast out. This is a repeating theme for Jesus, if you know. He says as much earlier in Matthew chapter 7 when he says, "Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only those who does the will of my Father." And he will repeat the theme once again in Matthew 25 in the unforgettable story about the sheep and the goats. Whatever binary we might be tempted to draw, did you see how Jesus made it none of our business to decide who the good and the bad people were that were being invited into the banquet, into the kingdom? Kingdom people are characterized then by a certain self-forgetfulness of our own goodness. It is one of the characteristics of being kingdom people that we don't know that we're good. Lord, when did we do that for you? When did we serve you? Instead, we are called to live out a life now declaring this invitation to others without reservation, without prejudgment. In so doing, Jesus collapses whatever binary vision of the world we may have internalized. Why? Because, as Abraham Kuyper has famously declared, there's not a square inch in the whole domain of human existence over which Christ, who is Lord over all, does not exclaim, "Mine." Our sense of our religious piety, our sense of our spiritual stature is not the same as God's sense of it. Particularly for those of us who hear God's invitation clearly to enter into the banquet, we must not mistake that invitation as some sort of a presumption that we've somehow earned it over against others, that we are somehow more worthy than others. We are a people formed merely by God's invitation and hospitality. But we are a people formed by God's invitation and hospitality. Hallelujah. Seeing this then, this clearly involves a different posture than the oppositional one that I mentioned earlier. It involves seeing the image of God in others, even those we feel the most distant from. And it involves respecting the one who created heaven and earth to know what he is doing. If this is the case, instead of standing oppositionally to those on the outside, we're called to stand invitationally. A posture not in hostility, my friend Greg says, but rather in hospitality. So let us pause for a moment here in a moment of self-reflection as we ask ourselves, is my spiritual life characterized by hostility toward the world or by my hospitality toward others? Is our community characterized by its boundaries and gatekeeping or by its generosity of invitation? Now, here's the thing. The parable does not end there. Although it might have been nice and neat if it did. Because instead of a nice, neat ending with everyone dancing at the party and a rather straightforward message about God's grace for the outsider, Jesus continues the parable with a plot twist. The king notices that among those who have entered into the banquet, there are some who have come to the banquet without their wedding garment, it says. And it becomes a big deal. Commentators are all over the place in exactly what this is. Is it like an ancient version of the tuxedo, some sort of formal wear? Or is it like what we might describe as Sunday best? Or even just clean clothes? What is it? But whatever it is, Jesus clearly implies that it wasn't something unfair for the king to expect. It was about coming to the party well. For sure, it wasn't just a breach in etiquette, but a dishonoring of the invitation. It was, after all, a wedding banquet. So the king finds it a deep affront to his hospitality. And this guest is punished and cast out for his failure to appreciate what it means to be invited to the banquet. An invitation creates an expectation, not only for the host, but to the invited as well. All invitations do. Esther and I will be attending a wedding next week, and I haven't a thing to wear. Why does that even matter, right? Why can't I just go however I want? Because a part of accepting the invitation, well, is to accept that there is a value in appropriate attire, appropriate way of being at the wedding. And to be invited unconditionally does not mean that there are no expectations upon the invited. The theologian Stanley Hauerwas, commenting on this section, says for us, the church, to be dressed in a wedding robe, then, is to be clothed in the virtues of the kingdom. Virtues bestowed upon us through our baptism. If the church is to create a people capable of hospitality, it will have to be a community of holiness, set apart by our wearing of the values and the character qualities of God, God's self. So the disciple question for us then is, what are the qualities of the wedding garment? If we were to take the binary, oppositional perspective of our reality, this wedding garment might look a lot more like the qualities expected of a high-level debater, a prosecutor, undercover investigator, someone set to prove the other side wrong, being combative, antagonistic, pugnacious, even might be considered positive qualities. And I'm going to confess, embarrassingly, that those adjectives nail my younger self in so many ways. But if you take the approach that our God, the creator of heaven and earth, the great host of the wedding banquet, now desires for us to love our neighbors and to extend his hospitality to the edges of our world, then the qualities of the wedding garment might be something much more like what Paul says in our reading for today in Philippians 4:8, which says, "Be clothed by filling your minds and meditating on things true and noble, reputable and authentic, compelling and gracious, the best, not the worst, the beautiful, not the ugly, things to praise, not things to curse." In hospitality, I would add, not in hostility. So what if we approach the world, our neighbors, or the outsiders, with the desire to extend God's hospitality with the generosity of heart that God has revealed to us, thinking the best, not the worst, listening to their stories with empathy rather than with suspicion, seeing the beauty in all of God's creation, looking for things to praise, not things to curse. I wonder how that might change the credibility of the church in our times. Can I suggest something for us to try as a practice? An actual thing for you to practice in your life this week or even today. One of the lovely things about Anglican theology is that it is embedded in our worship, in our liturgy. You're learning theology through your participation in worship, through the repetition, the antiphonal readings, the participation, the gestures, the standing up and sitting down. All of that stuff is teaching you theology. And part of my training to become a priest, I actually was talking to Tom earlier and said, all the things about being a good Anglican I learned through you, Tom, and through Dennis. So whatever failures I have as an Anglican, I tell people you could blame Tom and Dennis. But Dennis said something to me when I was being trained in the very early stages of my Anglican life. And Dennis is the consummate teacher, right? So he has a way of saying things that for the life of me I cannot forget. And he said, and you probably heard him say, that when you come up to receive your communion, to receive the bread, put your hands together and make a little throne. Because grace is never taken, but it is always received. To put your hands together and the priest will place the bread on it as God's grace is given to you. It is a simple gesture. Every time I take communion, it delights me as I receive from the table. As you receive it today, remember that this is God's hospitality to you. God serving you, God's meal, God's banquet provided for you. And now imagine that having received this grace, it is now your turn, and that you will turn around and extend that hospitality to someone on the outside of life for you. Someone that doesn't particularly look like you or live like you or even talk like you. Imagine a real face as you do this. Think of someone who needs this grace, not deserve this, but someone who needs it because they haven't been offered such a gift. And think of what form this beautiful act of hospitality will take place in your life as you extend God's grace to somebody else's life. You know, like the religious elites of Jesus' time, it is far easier for us to talk about what we believe than to embody what we believe. But Jesus says it over and over. It is far more important to God for us to live out our creed than to memorize it. We all know it. We don't need to dwell on this. But that gap between our confession and our lives, that's a credibility gap. We've seen this play out in our time in such a way that many of us honestly worry about the future of American Christianity, particularly for the next generation. But I do know that I find it strangely comforting that Jesus was talking about this 2,000 years ago. So if Jesus had hope enough to know this and teach this, even to those unrepentant hearts, then maybe there is still hope for us yet. Would you all close your eyes with me as we allow and believe in the Spirit's work to stir in us a right sense of the trouble that He might want us to get in, right sense of uncomfortable grace that He wants for us to extend as the Spirit stirs in our hearts, a willingness to be open to how we have been undeserving, and that in fact is good news for the world. Father, I lift up to you this wonderful family, these friends, new and old. May your Spirit work in us in this place. May we be formed by you. Amen.